A very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining in for today's live on the topic of unraveling masking and for people living with autism. And I'm excited to be here with Arpita and to have this conversation, very pertinent topic as well as we commemorate the World Autism Awareness Day, which is celebrated and commemorated every year on 2nd of April since the time UN passed a resolution back in 2007. April is also the Autism Acceptance Month. So it was our endeavor under Inclusion at Work vertical of Equilibrium Advisory to really continue having these conversations around autism. And as allies, what is it that we need to be doing to be able to create more affirmative workplaces, also as allies in societies as well. So I'm joined by Arpita today. Arpita Gaidani, they pronounce as she and they, is an artist and facilitator. They have crafted their life around a constellation of neurodivergence that includes autism, ADHD, RFM. Arpita curates experiences and creates art in the unique offering Illumine the Moment. She's also the founder and facilitator of Fireplace, a free of cost community gathering to cultivate safe and brave spaces. Fireplace is often the home of the queer and neurodivergent folks, though no one is turned away for being too normal. And you can know more about her on our website, arpitagaidane.com. So welcome, Arpita.
Thank you.
So Arpita, when we started this conversation, the whole idea was to be able to commemorate the day of World Autism Awareness Day, which is celebrated and commemorated every year on 2nd of April. This year, the theme has been to empower autistic voices to be able to provide more support to individuals living with autism as well, in order to ensure that they lead a more meaningful life and to be able to pursue successful careers. And at Equilibrium Advisory, we work very closely with organizations to have their policies, systems to be able to create support for folks living with diverse marginalized identities, with neurodiverse folks being one of them as well. And it's really a very important conversation to be had because even when you look at the studies, so there was a study published back in 2021 in the Indian Journal of Pediatrics is who published the study. And they said that the prevalence in India is really on the rise right now, where about 1 in 68 children may be diagnosed with autism. And the ratio between boys and girls is about 3:1. But there have also been a lot of conversations about how AFAB individuals, so assigned female at birth individuals, may not be getting diagnosed given the symptom, the criteria we have in DSM and ICD as well, because the presentation of autistic traits could look very different for women as well, right? And the whole idea would be how do we then start having these conversations around diagnosis of autism as well? What does the prevalence really look like? Especially, is there any difference in when you look at diagnosis in men and in women? And are our AFAB individuals really slipping through the cracks? Also, one of the other aspects is the idea of masking as well, which has also been seen as one of the reasons why AFAB individuals may not be diagnosed because they are masking and camouflaging. And that can again put extensive pressure on people living with autism as well to be able to fit into this neurotypical world. So my hope from today's conversation is to be able to shed light on these different facets here. Yeah. And I want to maybe start off with this conversation by inviting you to perhaps share with us that what does autism mean to you?
Thank you for that introduction. That was comprehensive. And if I may, even before I go into my individual sort of story and context, I'd like to add another layer to the lens that we might talk with today. And that is kind of this post-capitalist society that we're living in right now. So we're living right at the end of a huge COVID thing that showed up. The climate crisis is in place. I live in Bangalore. It is so hot right now. And these are kind of the larger things that are showing the cracks in the system of things that marginalized communities have already been experiencing for a long time now. And so when we look at autism, or when we look at these statistics around whether autism has existed or is increasing, or how it presents amongst different kinds of people, we can't really ignore how rooted that data collection is in system. to begin with. And so, like you already mentioned, where we have the patriarchy, there is also a certain sense of focusing on studies with assigned male at birth children and looking at their behaviors. And so, as a queer person myself, I also want to bring in further confusion. Samriti, I'm going to add a lot of confusion to our conversation. I'm telling you right now. Like,
And
there's
I
not
think
going
it's
to be
important, I think,
answers.
because I think
Yeah.
it's very important, Arpita, because none of us live one singular identity, right? There are
Yeah,
multiple identities
exactly.
that we live in. So we cannot
Exactly.
understand and experience through one lens. So I'm very glad that you're bringing in these
Yeah,
different lenses also. And I don't think these are confusions. I think these are the realities that we need to really acknowledge. So thank you for bringing that
absolutely.
forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a workshop that I did recently. It's called Delicious Diversity. And it was looking at how 1,500 species in nature that we know of as human beings are pure. And so the idea is that, there are seahorse males that are giving birth, and there are fishes that are turning from male to female. So this idea that we have that is so somehow set up in old standards of society, this is male, this is female, is flawed in the first place. And in places like the US right now, there's a huge war going on around trans bills and basically right to identity of trans and intersex people. And we have our own variations of that here as well. But um, all of that to say that even when we say assign male, assign female, even within that, there's a huge spectrum, just like autism itself shows up as a huge spectrum. And so, yes, there is a sort of duality that has been forced on people, because of which certain people have been told you have to behave like this. You have to play with dolls, you have to play with vessels, you have to grow up to dream that marriage is the only reality that you will have as an adult. You have to be subservient to other people always. But it's cracking because, these things are untrue. And ultimately, as human beings, we can't keep up these facades for very long.
And thank you for spotlighting all of these aspects. And I think there is also politics around language as well, right? When you talk about
Absolutely.
what is being queer, what is subservient, right? And each
Yeah.
one of them is such a layered and nuanced word as well, because we're also talking about what does subservience really mean, right? And
Yeah.
who are we being subservient to? And then how does power interplay really happen in these spaces as well?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I know this conversation can be so nuanced right now, and I'm
Yes.
really hoping that we can continue these conversations. And today is maybe just first of the many, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to really, for all our viewers and listeners to understand the position that you and I are taking right now,
Yeah.
let's start with what is known, and then to be
Yeah.
able to stretch the possibilities of it's not known as well, right? So
Yeah.
let's start with maybe keeping autism at its focus, and then I
Hmm.
want you to please branch out and bring in those multiple identities, multiple experiences as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. So back to my own story then.
yes.
Yes. So I got diagnosed only last year at the age of 33. And I started questioning my own autism when I was watching TV, actually. There used to be a show called Parenthood, and Ray Romano was watching a younger character get diagnosed, and he thought, man, am I autistic? And I saw him doing that, and I thought, man, am I autistic? And so that's where my journey sort of began. And I'm really grateful to media in that sense that there is that sort of exposure, I think. Um, and I do acknowledge that I come from a certain privilege, that I speak English and I am a Western um, OTT watching person. And in that sense, that's how I had access to parenthood. But in India as well, now there are mediums that are vernacular, like you mentioned, language, that are looking at talking about autism. And in some ways, I feel like these things, neurodivergence in general, has always been around, but perhaps the spotlight on recognizing it is more, because before this, there might have been a certain amount of suppression. There might have been, like in my case, I can certainly talk about a lot of intergenerational trauma. Masking, my masking comes from my own family and their patterns of masking that come from their own families and ad infinitum. And so it's really sort of complicated to say like how autism presents, and how it came to be. Even in my case, I just know that I've always felt a little strange, and that I feel more comfortable with certain identities and reading about other people who also seem to identify in those similar ways.
And I would like to maybe unpack a little bit more, Arpita, if that's okay. Because
Please. Yeah.
you said that the diagnosis happened at the age of 33 when you were watching
Mm,
parents.
mm.
And I'm wondering, what was it that you're observing and watching on the as part of the show that resonated with you and that got you thinking that, am I autistic?
So many things. I think it was the sense of having passion projects. So in my case, I have gone through like a wide variety of. I've practiced at a spiritual ashram, and I've been an artist, and um, I'm a facilitator, and I've been all over the place following different passions. And oftentimes, from the neurotypical lens, I felt like a failure, or have been told by people, "Oh, you never have the tenacity or the persistence to finish a project." But later on, to see that this character Max, or Ray Romano's character, that they had this kind of passion for the things that they were, whether it was photography or whether it was animals. Seeing that, or seeing the kind of focus, or seeing an aversion to small talk, or an inability to pick up on social cues exactly. And here you'd mentioned being an AFAB individual. So for me, it took me a longer time to understand my own presentations, also because sometimes, or actually most of the time, we mask best with ourselves. And so, it took a while to even figure out, oh, is that really me, or is that masking? Am I really this gregarious person that everybody thinks I'm an extrovert? Or am I actually a really shy introvert who is imitating extroverted people because that's what feels safe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in my work as a therapist, also in working with adults, who've often stumbled upon this diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
Because the diagnosis has
Yeah.
not really happened, right? And the experience is very polarizing. On one hand, it has brought in a lot of relief because they're able
Yeah.
to make sense of the experience as well because of so much of judgment around this. Like you said, that
Yeah.
being averse to small talk, and people say that what's the big deal, right? And there was a judgment placed with that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And having that diagnosis, at least with my clients, has brought in a sense of relief as well at that
Mm,
point in
mm,
time. There's also been a lot of worry because they've stumbled upon this is not a clinical diagnosis.
mm,
What if it's not true, right?
mm,
That's something that has
mm.
really grounded them, that diagnosis,
Yeah.
what if it's going to be taken away from me? And then the worry of even going and speaking to a clinician as well or to a mental
Yeah.
professional because
Yeah.
it is so valuable at that point in time, right? And then the other aspect brings in the terms of that this implicit pressure just to conform these societal ideas,
Yeah.
right? That how one really needs to be. And again, that these expectations come in from these multiple identities that we hold as well.
Yeah.
Maybe
Absolutely.
as an AFAB person or someone assigned to me at birth as well, someone who's English speaking, a
Yeah.
therapist, or a professional, or
Mm.
maybe a son, daughter, holding different
Yeah.
as well as a partner. There are these expectations that come in with it. And
Yeah.
how we then tend to mask as well to be able to fit in, not to disappoint others, but like you said, as well, that you're masking with ourselves, not to disappoint ourselves, that I'm not
Yeah.
able to uphold those
Yeah.
roles,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Can you help me understand, and the viewers as well, how did you navigate that space once you did come across that you are someone who could be living with autism as well?
It was, I think, like life, it was a firework of emotions, just all of them. And I remember also being very angry of having gone through that experience of having to mask, and um, we don't choose our families. And I had that whole thing of like, man, are there other people out there who were supported from the beginning, and why didn't I get to have that? to then growing into also understanding my family as well might have a certain streak of neurodivergences, and they were doing what they could within their circumstances to understand their worlds in their context. So each strand, like this was one around anger, but each strand has had that kind of like a journey going through. So yeah, even with the joy, like there's a book called Divergent Mind by Janara Nerenberg, and that's focused specifically on women with neurodivergence. And reading those stories, that was incredibly helpful because like it's not easy. Like the first thing, so I looked at these men figuring it out, white men, and then I started Googling, and then a lot of the things that were showing up were like white boy autism situations that may not apply to me at all. And then to find, like, keep on looking, because I think the more marginalizations one has, the more research one has to do to find something ultimately that feels remotely identifiable, because it goes through all of the lenses of different kinds of sexism, of race, of whatever, of location, until there is some identification. So that research was a lot of work, but ultimately also a lot of joy causing. And I had good community at the time as well. People who were discovering their own neurodivergence, people who inspired my thoughts so I didn't have to do the journey myself. The first therapist that I was seeing at the time actually told me that she just wasn't equipped to deal with neurodivergence because it's not something that at that time, and this was maybe 3 years ago, at that time was spoken about so much in India. So I actually switched therapists until I found someone who felt comfortable with neurodivergence and with talking to me about this. So having that space of self-diagnosis was also complicated because, do I believe myself? Am I making it up? And am I making it up is a very dangerous sentence that a lot of marginalized folks face with histories of abuse, with histories of any sort of, anywhere that one hasn't been believed. So yeah, many complicated threads.
Yeah. And thank you for really bringing that voice as well, right? That am I making it up? And I think it's also a good space to reflect that whose voice is it, right? Because it's often not ours, because we are able to resonate with some experiences right now, but then this constant voice of having to fit in is like, am I making it up? Maybe I'm reading too much, because there's also another, like, oh, it's just on a spectrum. So, perhaps it just, I'm reading too much into this, I should just let it pass right now. And I think that also puts a lot of pressure and makes it even harder to accept ourselves, right? And then which also brings in around feelings around self-doubt, questions around self-worth, to be able to really present ourselves and be vulnerable also, that this is how I'm really feeling. And as a therapist, I've also come across people saying that it has taken a very long time to even feel vulnerable enough to share those thoughts, that this is what I am resonating with. And to be able to really articulate it also means that I'm moving away from the neurotypical world, that I am different. And different, again, has its own connotation in the society. Right? That different is not good. It's not good enough.
Yeah, and if I may add, like there's a whole set of layers that can happen in the mental health journey of a person like this, because you read out my constellation of neurodivergences, and there's a whole other layer that you didn't read out, and that was OCPD and PTSD and anxiety and depression, and that is so perfectionism, trauma. Depression, anxiety, these are all things that essentially emerged in my life because there wasn't the capacity to be seen in a safe environment in the beginning. And the body tries, right, to do whatever is possible in such environments. But that led to really, really complex trauma. And I had a few years of my life where I was so debilitated by depression that I literally couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't eat. And my partner would come to me with a piece of paper and say, eat food, yes, no, and I'd tick. And that's the most that I could do. And so these are very real journeys that people can go through, where already we feel different, and then we're being doubted. And so the social, and this is the context that we sort of set in the beginning as well, the social burden then falls on us. But we start believing that it's our own burden, that it's not society that is also damaged in some way and is not able to uphold us.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's also been the conversation, right? The needle has really shifted from the medical model to the rights movement as well. We're talking about that disability does not rest with the person, it does rest with the system.
Absolutely.
When talking about neurodivergence is just another facet of humanity right now. It's not a disorder. And I think that's what the movement is talking about right now, that we don't have to localize the challenges and difficulties in the person, but how do we really then make systems that is able to support individuals who have different ways of thinking and functioning as well. And where different is not being bad, it's just different.
Yeah. And in fact, like, even with neurodivergence, we say it simply, but within it, there are so many constellations. There's so many, like a person might have a combination of autism and ADHD and OCD and any number of things. And with every individual, whatever constellation that is, looks different based on their cultural factors. And so to even sometimes my friends and I were just joking around about who really is even neurotypical. Like, how many of us are entirely neurotypical when the pressure of masking is taken away from us? Were it taken away from us, what would be left?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think since we're talking on masking, I want to also bring forth that conversation really, because that's where you spotlight as well. But I want to make it like a twofold conversation. One is that we know from your experience, and also research has shown this, and even with some of my clients, right, where the diagnosis has not happened for AFAB in folks, because of how autism presents itself in men and women. Right, I'm taking a binary position right now. I'm not bringing in the other genders and other realities as well. Which is very, very important, but just to be able to not simplifying it too much, but just to be able to still create more awareness, because that's also one of the intentions of this live, is that if you can help us understand that how does it really present, how does autism present itself in men and in women, and what are the challenges that comes forward in the delayed diagnosis for women, especially, or AFAB individuals.
So I'll speak to my own experience, because again, I've been reiterating that it's really hard to mention multiple experiences at once. But oftentimes we live in a society where boy babies, perhaps even when they're born, are born with a certain amount of privilege. And there's a certain amount of space given to them where they're told it's okay, like, you don't have to cook, you don't have to clean. I'm going down to the real basics of like the nitty-gritties of growing up in a household. It might be that girl babies very early on are initiated into having chores, mimicking what the life of a married woman later on would look like. And I know that we live in a fast changing world, so I'm giving like a very generalized story here. But because of this, where a boy baby crying might be taken seriously, a girl baby crying might be told to shush, or like, don't make noise, or you're disturbing the men of the house. So that's, I'm saying babies because that's how young it begins, and it keeps going. So throughout schooling, teachers will discriminate. There are different points of time where society in general has this sort of privilege lens, because of which AFAB people in general listen to adjust more in general, and being told basically your opinion doesn't matter, make yourself smaller, just do what the other person wants. And it's a power play thing, right? We said earlier, and it's really about that. And so when we look at the way autism has also been studied, and the word autism itself is kind of autoism, so focusing on the self, and the study that kind of went into like male people as focusing on themselves more, or focusing on their needs more, or like having a sort of blinkered perspective might be one way of looking at things, or might have certain, like, not recognizing social cues, having certain behavioral idiosyncrasies, or sometimes where this high functioning topic showed up, being savant, which is what kind of popular culture has really made a whole thing out of. And these things may have been true for girl children, but there's no space for them to exist. So there's no space to be brilliant at something. Like if a child is brilliant at sports, but she's being told, no, you can't go there, you have to be here and cook. There's no way to say whether that would have even grown or not, and what opportunities present themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, like for me, there's also it's entirely a social situation because of which AFAB autistic people manifest differently from the pressure.
Absolutely. And also when you're looking at how it could present itself as well, but also fit into what the expectations again are. Like it's
exactly.
usually more okay for AFAB folks to be quiet, to be withdrawn, not talking much, not being out there. But if AMAP folks are not doing that, that seems like a problem, right? That it's not okay. And which also then gets picked up much more frequently than it would be for AFAB folks as well. Because again, the social systems the way they are structured as well, and expectations that lie at its core as well, right?
Absolutely.
And then because of this instructional method that we have of being, even that some survey, like be here, do this, which also mean that AFAB individuals also tend to mask much more, to be accepted, to fit in, to belong, to get those validations. Because again, society almost reinforces that behavior.
And in fact, like what you said actually brought me to another really important facet, which I haven't spoken about yet, is that the masking also happens for AMAP individuals. And for them, it's more be gregarious, be a breadwinner, be, so if they're more sensitive, and I have experienced this in my own life with close friends, where a really sensitive person might have to go through a lot of trauma because they're not allowed to be that way, because they have to follow certain. So it's not like one kind of people is more, it's the system is oppressing everybody in their own special ways.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because when we're talking about the implications of those expectations, right? Where for AFAB individuals, not true for everyone, but we see that some of them, with AFAB individuals, the diagnosis may not happen. And that's the result of that, of how society is structured, right? The other impact on AMAP individuals would be the fact that there is higher burnout, more camouflaging as well, and greater need to again mask to be able to fit into the neurotypical world. Like you said, that there is this pressure to be gregarious, to be out there, to be extrovert. Not saying again it happens only with AMAP; it could happen with AFAB as well. But again, how structures are really, our society is structured, it has that impact on masking, right? Since you've been using this word masking as well, I think let's even unpack that for the viewers. That what does masking really mean? So maybe I'll invite you and then get your views on what does really masking and autistic masking really mean.
So masking in and of itself, I feel like it's a tool, like any other tool that all of us in some ways use. Like I'm wearing makeup like right now, and that's one way of masking, right? And it's not in and of itself good or bad. So it's a way that I can build a wall or a boundary around myself, such that what is inside doesn't leak out, and I can make that choice of, does this person feel safe enough to engage with to the depth of vulnerability that I want to at the moment or not? But that comes from a space of being empowered. And you were speaking about empowerment, and so it's really important to name that, because I often feel like in autism circles, masking gets seen as like this bad thing that we do, and it's something that has really damaged us, and it has. I'm not taking that away. but there is also a point where I have learned that it's important. That when I get to choose my masking, then it's really empowering to have
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so, what it essentially is just having boundaries, having behaviors that put up a facade, that put up a mask, literally, like the word says, so that what is inside doesn't go out, and what is outside can often come in, but at least what is inside doesn't go out. And so, and it starts in children early on. Like, I know that when I was very little, I used to be sick a lot, and I remember once I was coughing a lot at night, and my father just sort of yelled, for me to be made quiet. And it was just that one moment, but then I was like, now I won't cough out loud because that's rude, or like that's disturbing, or and it's again like really tiny examples to talk about much larger things and issues as well. um, and I think autistic brains, like or autistic nervous systems, often also have a lot of plasticity and a lot of imagination, a lot of curiosity, creativity, and this can go into really figuring out imitation. And
Yeah.
so we may not be great at understanding social cues, but we may spend a great amount of time trying to mimic what other people are doing until we perfect it to the degree that it seems natural to someone watching from the outside, so that we're safe within, even though inside it may make no sense as to why I'm behaving this way. Like, I'm not making a link between my behavior and how it's landing for the other person. But
Yeah.
I know that if I smile a lot, then people will find me pleasant, and then I can go under the radar for a lot of things. That's one example.
Yeah. Yeah. I think while I was listening you talk, I think there were three things that were broadly standing out to me, Arpita.
Mm,
One is that the way you use the word tool, that,
mm,
masking is like a tool or a strategy. And I think it's
yeah,
also a way of protecting ourselves,
yeah,
right? It's
absolutely.
to be able to take care of one's own well being.
Yeah,
And that's again, it's very important to understand why masking really happens in the first place, right? Because it's
yeah,
not feeling safe enough to be vulnerable, or even not knowing how to be as well,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because
absolutely.
of the models that we have around us and what is being reinforced or appreciated or being applauded. Masking is a way of just protecting ourselves and taking care of ourselves, right? That's one thing. And what you also mentioned, that it starts very young, and
Yeah,
we may not even have the vocabulary for it as well.
yeah,
Young children also know what is okay for them, and how to take care of themselves, and it's happening at such a
yeah,
subconscious level,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the third thing, what really happens, is the implication of it, of doing it for such a long time that it becomes
yeah,
exhausting. uh, and
absolutely.
and what you spoke on mimicking, right? I've had young adults come to me
Mm,
in the therapeutic conversation saying that I don't even know who I am, because I've
mm,
because I've mimicked for such a long time, and I've
yeah,
been operating from of how I need to be or how I should be. I don't know
yeah,
who I am. I don't know
yeah,
what my preferences are, because it's also an
absolutely.
experience of confusion that has stayed with them throughout their life. To
Yeah,
be able to not really have space to be able to really sit down and embrace their own selves, and really
yeah,
have those questions being asked as well.
yeah,
Because the idea has been just to safeguard ourselves, and how do I just go under the radar, and that
yeah,
becomes the foremost
yeah.
important thing in those moments.
And Sapti, the implications of that are absolutely huge, because when you go into your career, or if you go into your relationship, or anywhere really where life really matters, one of the things that we do as adults is choose. This is who I want to be. This is who I want to be with. This is where I want to work. And suddenly one is faced with, having been told, you have it all together for a really long time, and then suddenly being told, okay, now you can choose. And like, what do I choose? I don't know how to choose. I don't know what to choose because I've been pretending for so long. And so it can really be disorienting.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Mm,
And and like you mentioned also, that it has very strong implications, right? And we did talk about, when you did speak of how it could result in anxiety, depression,
Yeah.
PTSD,
Yeah.
OCD. Can we unpack a little bit more of how that really happens? What is the experience really like? You did touch upon it about experience with depression.
Yeah.
If I could also invite you to talk about people's experience in because you did mention that you have friends,
Yeah.
and if their experience is something that you could talk about or shed light on people that you may have worked in through your community groups as well.
Yeah.
What does a railway experience look like? Because it is exhausting, right? It can result into burnout as well. It can bring
Absolutely.
in so much of it's disorienting. It can be there can be identity crisis, and that conflict can be immense, right? And
Yeah.
and if there are no systems of support in
Yeah.
family or workplaces, that can also have its consequences. So if we can maybe
Exactly.
just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I feel like in the community spaces, especially, it almost feels like just having spaces like these is such a huge thing for people to be able to see other people going through the same thing and go, oh, like I said, I'm not making it up. I am
Yeah,
not alone. Is such a huge relief. Like, even even these conversations don't happen. So people are going through it entirely within their own tiny bubbles of space. And how much can one person really handle? I mean, we live in a complicated world already, and all of the world is inflamed right now in many, many ways. And within that, to also be struggling to just be seen, to just be heard, to just be, and all of this also has, again, like the background of, does this person have some amount of wealth that they can spend some time discovering themselves, or do they also have to be working constantly in order to just sustain themselves while going through all of this? Um, the pressure that the mixture of all of these things creates is insane. It's immense. And yeah, that's what I've seen at Fireplace, which is our community space. And it's that when people come there and they just meet each other, and we'll have, like, every once in a while we'll have topics like neurodivergence. Next time we're going to be talking about polyamory. So just really like varied topics, and just space for people to come up and say, oh, wow, like, I'm not alone. Just that much
yeah,
is such a huge thing. I mean, which is not to minimize that we need systems in place and we need workplace inclusion, all of those things. It's really important. Um, but yeah, even the first step of just being able to acknowledge it for ourselves.
yeah. And I think, and that space for the community, I think, becomes very important, right? Because
Yeah.
it does diminish marginally the sense of loneliness,
Yes.
right?
In a
It's
huge way.
also diminished that question that am I making it up?
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
a sense of validation can
Yeah.
also just maybe add a level of support for the self-worth that's much needed, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's
So
what we do
much.
beautifully as well in these
Yeah.
spaces. Yeah.
Yeah.
Arpita, now I want to bring in the other realities and other identities as well, right? So,
Mm.
a neurodiverse folks, who's queer or with a disability, uh, if or from a particular caste, if you were to really bring in these other
Yeah.
identities as well into the mix, and what is the experience like for the person living with autism with these multiple identities which have also been marginalized uh, in the system, and what does that really look like, and how does masking really look like in these spaces?
Um, well, to put it simply, it's horrible. And I think I'm just laughing again to mask the pain of what is really intensely a horrible experience. And I don't know what there is to say as such, in that, think of it as like, you remember in maths they used to teach geometric progression and algebraic progression, so 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 versus 1 into 2 is 4, 2 into 4 is 8, 8 into blah blah blah. Um, it really is like, it's like that geometric progression. So it's not that if you have two different marginalities then you have two issues. It's like With 2 you have 4, and with 4 you have 8, and with 8 you have 16, and so on and so forth. And the problems keep on growing because um, at some point, like sustaining oneself requires a certain amount of energy. But if that energy is getting sucked up in just being stressed out all the time or being anxious or being depressed, then unless there is a support system at hand, it can be a very dangerous situation.
Yeah.
And people are living in incredibly dangerous situations, and especially now with the kind of isolation that we're facing, where communities are not so strong anymore, and society in general is coming a little bit untethered. Um, it's it's quite dangerous, and suicide rates are increasing. Like it's scary.
Yeah. And while we talk about this entire landscape, I think it's also important to acknowledge the power hierarchies within this landscape as well.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
right? And I think that's again something I would like to maybe invite you to talk about, because when we're talking about even autism, highly
yeah,
functioning, low need for
yeah,
support as compared to high need for support.
yeah,
Like I said, we have certain movies out there, they're talking about people living with autism, these savants and have this some abilities, which is can be very, very enticing for some organizations as well, right? And that's how the pitch also comes out sometimes.
yeah,
Then we are also talking about people, autistic people with queer identities as well. And in that as well, there are hierarchies between, say,
yeah,
gay, lesbian, and bi. There are these hierarchies there as well, right? So then we have
yeah,
trans folks. We also have people with
yeah,
abilities and there are
yeah,
these hierarchies that do exist, and
yeah,
there also tends to be conversation around in group and out group within those communities as well.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so one is an experience which can be alienating, uh, and then there could be further alienation that can happen within those communities as well,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then having to mask within those communities to be accepted.
yeah, yeah. In the US civil rights movement, there was this slogan that came up, and it was not just bread, but roses too. And the idea is that we don't just want equality to sustain ourselves, but we also want the beauty. We want the
Mm.
fragrance, right?
Yeah.
And I think that thought um, somehow gets lost in a lot of these fights because a lot of communities have to fight to be seen, be heard. And sometimes, just like we were discussing with masking, we forget what our true nature is and we just become that mask. The fight takes over. And then it becomes, for me at least, I think what's important is like how much can we see the humanity
Mm.
within each of these boundaries and hierarchies as well. Um, because ultimately we do have to coexist as human beings. And the idea is that we're never going to have a homogeneous, I mean, ideally we don't want a homogeneous culture, right? We want to celebrate diversity. And that means fighting, and it means conflict, and it means like learning how to squabble, but then how to make peace out of it in a beautiful way. And so the way that we address communication, engaging with each other, needs to be different. But until that happens, these hierarchies very much do exist within the different sorts of kind of systems that end up like mini systems that end up happening within the larger system because that's what we know.
Mm.
And so activism has often followed the route of capitalism um, because that's what we've known. But that's why it's so interesting now to figure out what can we do differently? What can we do in a way that we're not excluding anyone? Um, I'm not saying it's easy in any way whatsoever, but it's the only way left to us because clearly
Absolutely.
what we've been doing is not working.
Yeah. So I want to then segue into that conversation. What can we do differently? What can schools do
Yeah.
differently? What can workplaces do differently to be able to build that systems of support for people living with autism?
You know, this whole thing about comparison that we've built so much into our systems, if we can work a little bit at chipping away at that,
Mhm.
that would be a really great start.
Mhm.
Um, because the idea is to celebrate differences, right? So, for
Yeah.
instance, here I am sitting and talking to you, and we're in this LinkedIn Live. But in order for me to be here, I had to sit here with two pebbles that I'm playing with because they make me comfortable, and an oil because that'll help me settle down, and a bottle of water, and pajamas, and just like, all these things just to make me comfortable so that I could be present to our conversation. And those are the tools that, again, I have figured out for myself. So if in schooling, in workplaces, in society in general, people have some amount of freedom to figure out what is it that works for us to take care of ourselves, what is it that we need to take care of each other, what kind of support systems can we create, can we check in regularly with each
Mm.
other, can we, figure out like lists of words to name needs. If we come from backgrounds where we don't know how to ask for needs, it may seem like a really small thing, but it's huge to be given examples of needs because
Yeah.
sometimes we just don't know what they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah. So tools like this, I think, could really go a long way in making, just not making fun of things that are different, just not comparing constantly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's really at the core, right? The comparison.
Yeah.
Because when you talk, even these terms itself, this neurotypical neurodivergence, that's also comparison,
Yeah,
right?
constantly.
So because we are saying that you're divergent, and like I said, there's also
Yeah,
politics around language because what is being divergent?
yeah,
You're
yeah,
moving away from the course that has been set out.
yeah, exactly. And who set out this course anyway? I mean, if we look at the history of all existence, technically the course is being set by nature, right? So
Yeah.
if we can look at nature for a second, and I really love the work of Adrienne Marie Brown in this regard. She does a lot of work around looking at nature symbols to find learnings for what we can do, and it's called emergent something, I'm forgetting the name, emergent strategy, yes.
Mm.
And the idea is, how can we have emergent strategy, how can we have presence? So instead of being wanting to be like, that common metaphor become common now, like a fish can't climb a tree. And similarly, in a school, if a child is a fish, then you can't expect them to climb a tree. So, what
Yeah.
are ways in which we can recognize people for being trees and fish in mountains and whatever, and find them the environments that you know
Mm.
that they can thrive in, and then we can find ways to thrive with each other. That sounds incredible, actually.
Yeah, yeah. It actually reminds me of the conversations I was having with one of my clients at a therapeutic session. Then we have similar kind
Mm.
of a metaphor. And they said that if you're a fish and you had to climb a tree, what would you do? So so the client said, I'm going to find a bowl with water, put myself into that, and then go up to the tree. And this is what thinking was, right? That how do we get
Mm.
there? It's not that
Yeah,
if I will be able to get there, but how do I really
yeah,
get there?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Right? And that's where the conversation need to really shift.
yeah,
The other paradox that we really see is that we're constantly reinforcing thinking out of the box
yeah,
while focusing people to be inside the box.
yeah,
How
yeah,
about you could have people outside the box, and then thinking of the box will also become a lot more easier, right? And how do we create those spaces as well? Or the idea that there is no box, there is just
exactly.
one space, right?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
And how do we bring in that fluidity as well in these spaces? Because when that fluidity comes in, we are also reducing the possibility of being judged, being mocked,
yeah,
being belittled, or to even have the word that you're different. The difference comes in
yeah,
with those boundaries that have been set out.
yeah,
Yeah. And so when you really look at what can support really look like, is that how do we, like you said, there has to be no comparison. Comparison comes inside the box, outside the box,
yeah,
in group, out group, whether you are
yeah,
in the pond or in the tree, right?
yeah,
How do we
yeah,
able to bring in that fluidity as well, and that
yeah,
interconnectedness really come in? And I
absolutely.
think something so beautiful that you said, that no comparison, right? Which will also mean having more conversations, creating more
Yeah,
awareness. Uh,
absolutely.
where we know from our work as well, right, that when we are working with people with marginalized identities, because they are right now marginalized as well. We need to acknowledge that. It also helps people who are neurotypical in the systems
Yeah,
as well,
yeah,
right? So, for example, you
absolutely.
have grounding technique, like if you have a glass of water or a bottle of water and you have those pebbles, or you have a
Yeah,
ball that brings in experience of just soothing themselves out, it also
yeah,
helps so-called neurotypical people also when they're experiencing stress and anxiety.
yeah, yeah,
Exactly the tools that one uses, right? So
yeah,
when you're
yeah,
building these spaces also of sensory rooms, having
yeah,
objects inside which is accessible to all,
yeah,
it's not being only accessible to neurodivergent folks.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
the organizations can start thinking on those lines as well. We're having a
absolutely.
conversation around accessibility, around needs, is normalized for all because
Yeah,
of the fluidity of the nature.
yeah,
Right? That
yeah,
someone who is experiencing high levels of anxiety, who is experiencing high levels of stress, or perhaps is experiencing depression, or has been diagnosed with mental disorder as well, these are going to be tools that will support them.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one thing I do want to point out is, like even at Fireplace, we call it safe and brave space.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about creating safe spaces, creating these beautiful visions, but we live in a world that's far from it. And in order to get there, get to that safety, there's a lot of bravery that needs to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not, that's the thing, is that it's not easy and it's not rosy. Like there's a lot of also figuring out my needs or yours. What do I prioritize right now? And in this conversation, like my mental health may be low, but I also have a certain amount of work to create. So, what are the strategies that we can use such that I'm able to, finish that work, but in a way that I'm also cared for? So, what I'm trying to get at is that these are always going to be individual cases, and they're always going to be the idea is necessarily in presence and in kind of needing to strategize on a case by case basis as things come along, because it's a transition from one way of thinking and being, which is so rooted, like we're born into it, into this other beautiful way of like having accessible things and having conversations and all of that. But yeah, it's quite a journey to go through.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, Apathan, it's been a very, very interesting conversation so far, and I just want to maybe wrap it up by getting some maybe again falling into the trap of the instructional model that we have been again into, of some of the things that really are some things like do's and don'ts for creating these affirming autistic cultures or pro-neurodivergent cultures in organizations, right? Some of the things that
Yeah,
will be very important for leaders and employers and allies to know. Uh,
yeah.
Quick takeaways that they can maybe something to really hold on to as we wrap up this conversation.
Yeah, I think a simple way is to listen a lot,
Hmm.
and really pay attention. Like, not just listen because you're setting up a DEIB procedure in your environment and, now checklist, but
Yeah.
genuinely listen to people's needs. A simple thing is to kind of design equity models in your organization. So you can have like these agreements and guidelines that everybody co-creates. So we have this in Fireplace, where people honor themselves and each other's time, where people take space and make space so that the shy ones can have a little extra space and the ones that are very out there can maybe pull back a little, and people can have their own responsibility around this. There's no need for policing, or not unnecessarily giving advice in a space, trusting people to make their own decisions. So there are, I mean, I'm sure once one starts looking, there's a lot of guidelines and agreements out there that are already in practice. But finding things like this could be like really powerful. Having check-ins in organizations where relationships don't necessarily have to have a personal professional divide,
Yeah.
but where people's entire person gets acknowledged.
Yeah.
That could be an amazing thing. I could go on, so you have to stop me.
No, I think it's very important. I'm glad you're talking about all of this, and I think that's what we are also hoping to do. In fact, at Equilibrium Advice, we are launching a DEIB certification program called In This Together, starting in May. Which would be the idea is to be how do we really build those equity models as well, or to have to really understand in the truest sense what does diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging really mean, and what
Yeah.
can these systems of support really look like as well in schools and in organizations. And people are really committed to work towards building those inclusive spaces where it's okay for some people to take up more space and for some people to take up all the space as well with no
Mhm.
judgment as well. What
Yeah.
will those really fluid structures really look like? What will be those best
Yeah.
practices, guidelines for diversity managers, for allies, for people from the
Yeah.
community as well? What does it really mean for them? I think the idea would be for the certificate program to really unpack all of these things and build that sense of community as well, to be able to, again, diminish slightly that sense of loneliness,
Yeah.
to maybe bring in that sense of hope maybe slightly. But the idea
Yeah.
would be to undertake that endeavor as well,
Yeah.
and really empower individuals to be able to create, to affirm their experiences as well right now, and create work cultures which are truly not only supportive but also empowering. And so that's the hope that we also have. And this conversation was also to be able to just take a step towards it, of creating more awareness, doing our bit of advocacy as well, and
Yeah.
for people to know that they're not alone. There are many folks out there, and
Yeah.
some of us are maybe just email away from them. Yeah. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining in, Arpita. Any last word before we wrap up today?
No, I wanted to wish you all the best for this program that you're launching as well. And I had a brief look, and I got to see also that there's legal support and that it's in the context of India, which I think is incredibly important because one of the things that I do believe is that these movements have to ultimately be local, because every context we're in our tiny micro environments, right? And we can't apply what's going on in the West to here, or even what's happening in Bombay to Bangalore. Like we have to develop our own models. So I appreciate that localization you're bringing as well.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's what Equity Advisory really does as well. So it's a team of legal professionals and mental professionals. So the course would be again coming from this local piece of legislation that we have and the rights that individuals have, along with the understanding of psychosocial underpinnings. Because, like you said, the social context becomes very, very important to understand the experience as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, and I also wanted to give like an open invitation to Fireplace to you and anybody else who wants to come. The next one's going to be next week at 7:30 p.m.
Okay.
And like I said, we're talking about polyamory. So if anybody wants to be there, they're welcome. I will just put in the link to subscribe for the information.
Yes, please do. And I think
Uh,
Lab will be there for sure. And we'll also circulate it in our network. So thank you so much,
thank you.
Arpita, for taking on the time and being present here with us and really talking about your own experience. I think we take a lot of strength from it, but also I think at the same time, I would also like to acknowledge it's not easy to revisit those experiences as well. So thank you for being present here and creating the space for all of us. And I wish you
Thank
all the
you. You asked great questions. I really enjoyed myself.
same here. Thank you so much. Take care, Arpita.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.